Welcome. I'm Dr. Karshner, and welcome and thank you for coming to tonight's program. Here in the Dark, a conversation with Meagan Lucas, sponsored by the RMU Honors Program as part of their Summer's Read program, the Roger Gillan Visiting Writers Series, and the Department of English and Media Arts. Because tonight is the grand kickoff of RMU Storytelling Month, before I introduce Professor Lucas, I would like to remind you of our other upcoming events. A week from tonight, October 10th at 5 p.m. here in the atrium, actor and screenplay writer Cheech Monahar will be part of a roundtable discussion on screenwriting. Tuesday, October 15th, visiting filmmaker Connor O'Keefe will host a screening and discussion of his film, Queer Stories, at 7 p.m. in the Olsen family basement. Thursday, October 17th, and I think this is right, Dr. Pinson, at 12:30, your Bluegrass.
Oh, Lord child, yes.
Okay. Yes.
History of Bluegrass.
Yes, Dr. Pinson will be doing a history of bluegrass here in the atrium. Again, that's at 12:30.
Bring your own farm animal.
Okay. How could you pass that?
Bring farm animal.
Tuesday, and then finally, so tonight is the kickoff, and then Storytelling Month wraps itself up on Tuesday, October 22nd at 6 p.m. here in the atrium for the mother of all storytelling events, the annual Creepy Conference. There's set credit for all of these, and I encourage you to all come to as many of these as you can get to, because your support for these events are what keeps these community building events like Storytelling Month going. Your faculty, us and the rest of us here, are committed to giving you, the students, these experiences with the best storytellers a friend discount and goodwill can afford. So please keep coming. Tonight, I am pleased to welcome back RMU's first Roger Gillan Visiting Writer, and now the other half of the creative writing faculty, Meagan Lucas. Before I introduce Professor Lucas, I would like to say a few words about her work. I have wagered almost all of you in this room have read her work, especially if you're in the honors program. And if you aren't in the honors program, you have most certainly been introduced to her work in my class. Besides being a true craft person, she is also one of the most original and relevant writers working today. I'd like to offer, because those of you who have me in class know this, a brief academic context to her work. Lucas's work falls into the genres of gritlit, literary fiction, horror, crime fiction, and magical realism. What makes her work unique is that she is able to seamlessly blend these genres into her stories so that they can make a point, all the while keeping the reader engaged in a difficult story through a remarkably imaginative narrative. But her work is hard, it is unblinking, it is unapologetically raw. In a review, I characterized her work as being brutal stories beautifully told, and I stand by that. Her work is not meant to titillate like cheap misery porn. Lucas reaches back to the very beginning of literature to do what Aristotle said should be the purpose of literature: to shock us into looking at the things we are unwilling, unable, or unaware of in order to develop a shared experience, a political empathy, a common goal for the good that was the mark of a healthy society. Carl Alviani writes that storytelling represents the human capacity to use story as a problem-solving technique where creative effort shapes common goals shared by large numbers of people. Aristotle, 3,000 years ago, agrees, but said that the problem was getting literature to the common goal. Getting literature to be the common goal. And we see this, why do I need to take this lit course, right? He said that the way to do this was through tragedy, and tragedy needed to be absurd, extreme, shocking. Only through being exposed to the absurd, the most brutal story, will we pay attention to the root problem. Well, no one wants to read a story about the vulnerability of women within a society who sees female bodies as public property, have a little girl shove a stick in a boy's eye, or a woman confront the serial rapist murderer best friend of her husband on a jogging trail, will pay attention. You don't want to hear about poverty and the extreme things mothers will go through to provide for their children? How about if a woman starts finding gold nuggets in roadkill? Once the absurd captures our attention, once we are shocked into paying attention, we can start to have a conversation about what is really going on. Then hopefully we can be more inclined to see each other as neighbors rather than enemies. As Alviani points out, it is this alignment of human wants with art that makes the difference between progress and defeat. And this is the power of story. Professor Lucas says that the most common question she gets asked about her work is, Are you okay? And I've been thinking about that lately. When I was a young field researching folklorist, I worked in Navajo land with healers who used stories to restore balance to people affected by many of the same illnesses Professor Lucas writes about: poverty, social power imbalances, drug and alcohol addiction, physical, emotional, sexual, and religious violence. Yet, despite the difficulty of their work, these healers were happy, full of humor, silly, and those of us that remember Francis Burnside can remember his playful nature. I asked my Navajo Aunt Martha about this, and she said, "Those who choose to spend so much time in the darkness have to bring their own light." And for us as readers, we are lucky that Professor Lucas chooses to spend time in the dark to filter the difficult through the grotesque mask of tragedy for our benefit. As friends, colleagues, and students, it is a pleasure to work with someone so generous with their time and knowledge, and really just so kind. Meagan Lucas is the author of the Anthony-nominated collection Here in the Dark, which was the pick for this year's Honor Summer Read, and the award-winning novel Songbirds and Stray Dogs. She has published over 40 short stories and essays. She has been nominated for the Pushcart, Best of the Net, Derringer, and Canadian Crime Writers Award for Excellence multiple times, and won the 2017 Scythe Prize for Fiction. Her stories, The Monster Beneath and You Know What They Say About Karma, were listed as distinguished in the 2023 and 2024 Best American Mystery and Suspense. Her novel Songbirds and Stray Dogs was chosen to represent North Carolina in the Library of Congress 2022 Route 1 Reads program, and won Best Debut Novel at the 2020 Indie Book Awards. Her manuscript Soft Animals is currently longlisted for the Vauquin Award. She teaches creative writing here at Robert Morris University and the Great Smokies Writing Program at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. She is the editor-in-chief of Reckon Review and Pregnancy and Newborn magazine. And it was this combination of Professor Lucas's professional and industrial knowledge that she so generously shared that was instrumental in our creation of the Creative Writing Certificate that uses her concept of from premise to publication, giving creative writing at RMU a professional focus. Born and raised on a small island in northern Ontario, she now lives in the mountains of western North Carolina. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the weekly atrium award-winning writer and master storyteller, Meagan Lucas.
Hey y'all, it is an absolute honor to be here with you this evening. And that my book was chosen as your summer read is just really an incredible honor. I don't think I've ever been in a room with so many people who have read my book before. So before we get started, I just want to take a minute and thank the RMU Honors Program and Dr. Pambukian and the Roger Gillan Visiting Writer Series and Dr. Karshner and Dr. Spinson for inviting me to come here and talk to you today, and for all of you for showing up and giving me this soapbox. As Dr. Karshner mentioned, I live in Western North Carolina, and if you've been paying attention, you'll know that we suffered catastrophic damage in this last week because we were hit with the remnants of Hurricane Helene right after we received 2 days of rain that would have already caused a 100-year flood. My house received 20 inches of rain in 2 days, right after 2 days where we received 8 inches. And this is in mountain terrain with thin soil and tall trees. So when I left yesterday, my town was still without power, internet, and drinkable water. My kids' schools are closed indefinitely. My favorite restaurant had water up to the roofline, and the majority of smaller roads are impassable. There are many people who are trapped in storm-damaged homes, and the air was thick with the sound of rescue helicopters, and there were still 500 people missing. There have been 10 deaths in my town alone, and 76 in Western North Carolina so far. Entire towns are gone. Chimney Rock, Swannanoa, Marshall. The landscape of the region will never be the same. It was very hard to leave my children behind. To drive around the sinkholes and under the power lines and around the fallen trees to be here. To be honest, one of the only reasons I'm here is because I can fill my vehicle with supplies much more easily. The bottled water, toilet paper, food, and gas, the things that we don't have at home, I can bring them back. But I'm here too because I believe in the power of storytelling. The purpose of art is to disturb the comfortable and to comfort the disturbed. And I know that my being here to tell you what I've lived through and to teach you how to tell your own stories is a testament to how important storytelling is. So what I'd like to do, if that's okay, is I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes or so talking about my journey to writing, my process, and how I get stories onto the page and into your hands. Because I'm just egotistical enough to think that maybe there's a small nugget of wisdom in there. And that also as a reader, which I am, man, I love this backroom stuff, right? Seeing how the sausage gets made. And that's what I want to talk to other writers about. How do you do this? I'm also going to read you a newish story that isn't in the collection, and hopefully that will leave us some time with for Q&A. So I've talked about living in Western North Carolina, but if you're listening and you're thinking, oh, she doesn't sound like she's from Western North Carolina, and good catch. I was born and raised on a small island in Northern Ontario, and if you're familiar with Lake Huron and Lake Superior, there's a body of water between them called the St. Mary's River. And part of that river, there's a section called the Northern Channel, and that's where I grew up on a small island called St. Joseph Island. And it was, at the time, a bajillion years ago when I grew up there, the home to about 2,000 people. It's about half that now. And when I grew up, I was about 10 minutes outside of a town of 300. And the economy was primarily dependent on tourism, but also on a steel industry that was about an hour away. And I'm sure that you can recognize that in your own life. So I think that that's important because you can see why I write about rural communities and why I love small towns and why the working class and economically disadvantaged folks are really, really close to my heart. And if you've read the book, you've seen that. I left that tiny town and I studied history and English and religion for undergrad, and I moved to Michigan for grad school and got a master's in education, and I wrote my thesis on writing across the content area. And for you normal folks, the non-education nerds, that's using writing assignments to teach non-writing subjects. And if I'm ever famous someday and there's a Jeopardy question, my research was specifically on teaching female identifying students how to do complex math with writing. And I'm going to skip over the boring part where I married an American and we moved to the South and we had children. But Brody is 13 and Redding is 11. But I nearly didn't survive postpartum depression. And I don't tell you this out of pity, but because I want to educate you. And I think to do that here, I need to be obnoxiously, aggressively transparent. And my therapist pointed me at writing. And not just at writing, don't worry, I'm also well medicated, but it's writing that saved me. And I started where a lot of beginners do with blogging and personal essays, and I found what I needed, community, and I didn't have to hide my ugly. And I was allowed to say the quiet parts out loud. I was allowed in that context to share how unhappy motherhood made me when everyone else in my life wouldn't shut up about what a blessing it was. And I found that through writing, I wasn't the only one who felt that way. But me and my husband started being increasingly uncomfortable with all of those skeletons all over our lawn, right? So I tried fiction, and I found that with fiction, I could create enough smoke and mirrors, some distance to guard my family. And I could still write about what I wanted to write about, maybe even a realer, deeper truth through those lies. And with fiction, I could mine all of my traumas and not just the ones that I was brave enough to talk about specifically. So I moved from memoir to fiction, and it's 2014, and like every fiction writer, I want a novel. And so I write a novel, and I finish it, and I discover that it is objectively bad. Like, truly. And somehow every scene takes place in a car or a parking lot. And if I ever get all my other problems worked out, I'm going to sick a therapist on that, I think, because that's weird. But it's an important lesson for emerging writers, I think, that not everything you write is going to be publishable. you are going to throw away more pages than you publish. And that's just part of the job. So I have this shit novel, but I also intend to attend this workshop put on by the Great Smokies Writing Program at UNC Asheville, which I now teach for. And it was taught by the wonderful Wiley Cash. And it was on how to get published. And I had really high hopes that he was going to give me this secret, right? He was going to help me fix my novel. We were going to get it published. And instead he said, write short stories. And I thought, but I just wrote a novel. Like, that's way harder. And he said, short stories will help you practice your storytelling skills in a more controlled space. They're quicker to write, they're quicker to fix, they're quicker to get published, and they're quicker to throw away if they're garbage. So you don't waste 2 years writing a novel that takes place in a whole car. And that last part might have been me projecting, but you get the picture. Individual short stories give you a nice, safe box to learn how to write within, and they're also easier to place with publishers, and they help you build a platform and a readership and develop resilience and community, and they will help you sell your novel. So I love a plan. Tiny bit anal retentive, and so I embraced it, and I wrote short stories, and I got better, and I got published, and I thickened my skin, and I built my skills, and I learned the importance of critique and putting myself out there. And in 2018, I decided to play a game. And I was going to get 100 rejections in a year. I got 76. 76 no's. 76, you're not good enough, or we don't like your stuff. But I also sold a new, better novel and 12 short stories. Because I had made it a game, and every response, yes or no, was a win. And I lost that hesitance to put myself out there, and I didn't worry about whether it was a perfect fit or whether my work was good enough for such and such a market. I sent work everywhere, and I was pleasantly surprised. And that year I was nominated for my first pushcart. It felt good, but I wanted to be better, so I went back to school, and I got a master's in creative writing. And when you're going to school for writing, you're going to produce a lot of pages, even when you don't feel like it. So I started paying really close attention to where I got those ideas from so that I could produce pages even when I really didn't feel like it. Ron Rash, he's a Western North Carolina writer, and he famously talks about getting an idea for his biggest book, Serena, which you might have seen. It's a movie with Jennifer Lawrence and Bradley Cooper, I think, with the image of a strong woman on horseback. And my friend Pete Ferris, he got the idea for his novel when he thought about this image of an old man driving around with a mannequin in his car. But damn it if images don't work for me. I love the news, though. News stories where I'm introduced to people and situations that are outside of my own experience are gold for story ideas. It was a news story that triggered the first in that collection, Voluntary Action. I heard about how a person overdosed while in police custody in the Asheville jail, and because of a lack of training and a series of tragic circumstances, that terrible thing happened. But I could not stop thinking about why. And so that was the spark, or bolt of lightning, as I like to say. Collision, maybe, even. I banged into an idea and I couldn't get away from it. I couldn't stop thinking about what it would like to be like to be the responsible party, the police officer. How would that feel? How would it change my life? And as I explored those questions, characters and plots started to emerge. And if you've taken my fiction or my storytelling class here at RMU, you are familiar with the idea of a premise. I want to see some nods, y'all. Yeah, awesome. That's what takes your idea, right? Your suppose statement. Suppose the daughter of the king of the mer people sold her voice to the sea witch so she could walk on legs, right? That's your suppose, that's your premise. And it turns the story into a story by asking questions. What if the price of the legs was too high? What if she couldn't pay it off? What if she was tricked? What if someone told her daddy? And this what if thing just isn't an exercise that I make my students do. It's how I develop my own stories, my own work. And so much of turning an idea into a story for me is not just what if, but what if this were me? A number of the stories in the collection were sparked by the news, There's a story in there called You Know What They Say About Karma, which just got, as Dr. Karcher mentioned, named to the distinguished list in this year's Best American Mystery and Suspense. It's a response to a shooting that happened in my town, involving an unsecured handgun and a vehicle and a child. And I have children and I have guns, and they are not unsecured, but when my children were small, I would obsess about whether those weapons were safe, if my children could reach them. And in Karma, the story, neither of the protagonists are law enforcement, but in the true story they were. And I changed that detail because I didn't think that readers would believe me. But in researching that story, I also found out that the vast majority of gun crimes in my county end up being investigated by the state because they so often involve someone within or related to the sheriff's department. Gun culture in the United States, and specifically in the South, is terrifying to me, and so I'm kind of obsessed with writing about it. There's another story in the collection called Sitting Ducks that was triggered by an article that I read in the New Yorker about how South Carolina refused to evacuate its prisons, even the ones that were below sea level, in the path of a huge hurricane. Even the facilities where inmates would certainly die. After reading that article, I became obsessed with just the cruelty of people. Who were these prisoners and what were they feeling, and who could just leave other people behind? Another lightning striker collision creator sometimes is a prompt from a teacher or a magazine calling for submissions, and that's how Buttons got started. Cowboy Jamboree magazine wanted stories about the theme of a squint. Isn't that a great word, a squint? It's so weird and wonderful. And it made me think about eyeballs, which is not that original, but I have a pug, and his name is Flint, and pugs have these big, giant eyeballs, and they get injured really easily. And my mother-in-law told me this horrific story about a pug she had as a child and this really gross veterinary procedure that happened when the pug was injured. And that probably tells you more about her than it does about me, but it just tickled something in my brain. And the procedure is super gross, and I'm not going to tell you any more about it because if you haven't read the book, I want you to buy the book. But I was thinking, as I started writing that, about how often really terrible medical procedures are told that they're for our own good, and how often I heard that phrase as a child. And then I started wandering down this path of my own childhood and wondering if I could write a story about my childhood bully who maybe got some of his own medicine. And what emerged, I think, is this fun story with this really dark Southern Gothic feel about a little girl, Tilly, who is way tougher than me. Another story that had a weird prompt was The Monster Beneath. My friend Joey Poole, who is a writer, editor, and professor in South Carolina, was putting together an anthology and reached out to me, and he was like, "You write noir." And if you guys aren't familiar with noir, it's really stories that are characterized by a moral ambiguity. And I said, yeah, I love noir. And he said, well, what about noir but make it cryptids? And I'm like Bigfoot? And that is not my jam. But I really like to write about human monsters. And I also really like Joey and my friend Ed, who's a folklorist that you might know, was going to do it too. And so I gave it some thought. And Bigfoot is the cryptid in the Blue Ridge Mountains where I live, but I didn't grow up there. And I figured a lot of people were going to submit stories about Bigfoot and Mothman, and I didn't want to appropriate, and I felt like I needed to be different. So I started thinking about the cryptid that I grew up with in the northern Great Lakes, and that's Meshipeshu, the water panther from Anishinaabe lore. And I'm just going to break your heart, definitely Dr. Karcher's heart. I don't personally believe in cryptids or ghosts or anything I can't see. But I started wondering what it would be like to be a police officer who did. And how would that affect her job? And what could go wrong? And out emerged this story, The Monster Beneath, and last year it was, named distinguished to Best American Mystery and Suspense. So it must have worked. In another Wiley Cash workshop that I took, and I hope that you're reading his books, he talked about mining your own personal history for ideas, and you've probably noticed that a lot of writers are writing to process or deal with stuff that they should probably go to therapy about. And for me, honestly, that whole collection, that's what it is. But I write what's often referred to as grit lit, and it's a blend of literary fiction, which is rich with character and pretty prose, but it can be slow. I know, it can be boring. With genre fiction, which can be a little shallow emotionally, but is usually full of tension and plot and page turning. And usually grit lit takes place in rural settings, and it involves folks who are economically challenged, and I am not the only one who is doing this. David Joy and S.A. Cosby and Brian Panowich, or William Solden, who is read here, who is from Youngstown and writes just gorgeous, gorgeous Rust Belt grit lit. But there's not enough women in this space. And there aren't enough stories about women, and I got tired of reading stories about men, and I got tired of reading stories where the female character was really just a plot point, or was the reason why a male hero was activated, particularly if it was sexual assault that activated him. And I'm less interested in the mystery part of a crime story, or the who did it isn't really that exciting to me. What I want to know are the ripples. Who survived this, and how did they survive it, and how did it change their life, and what happens next? And every story in this collection is a little piece of me, and I've told you how I take this spark, and I run it through all of my trauma and baggage, but there are a couple stories that are particularly close to my heart. Picking the Carcass, that's the kind of gross nugget one. It's about the pressure to be perfect as a mom with no help. A mom just trying to do her best. I don't think anything captures the honesty of motherhood the way that horror can. Kittens is about addiction and all the ways it can destroy a family, and it comes from my own experience and my brother, who is now an addictions counselor in northern Canada. Molasses in Winter is a mystery, but it's also about being seen. And body image, which is something that I've struggled with my whole life. But definitely The Only Comfort is the most personal of them all. And it's the only story that I wish that we'd put a content warning on. I'm usually against content warnings. I think that they often ruin the twist. But in this case, when the book came out, I had to call a number of family members. That's always a little bit uncomfortable. On my father's side of the family, there are 6 kids and 18 grandkids, and we're Shetlanders. Everyone has the same fair coloring, pale, ashy blonde hair, fine, straight, with blue eyes, except for 4 of us. My dad, his sister Janice, and my cousin Ryan and me, and I always felt a connection with Ryan because we looked like family. The dark eyes, the curly hair, the chubby cheeks. And as we became adults, I realized that we were both artistic, and we loved storytelling, and that we all both struggled with depression. And in my family, we did not talk about that. So 5 years ago on my wedding anniversary, Ryan took his own life, and we still don't talk about it. And I needed to talk about it, so I wrote that story. Because I write to process my demons and to figure out the world. Not every writer is the same way. But I do think that one thing that we share as writers is a passion for observation and for understanding. We watch and we listen and we notice things that others might not, and we use those observations to try to understand the world. My first published novel, Songbirds and Stray Dogs, started that way. I was sitting in a coffee shop in my town, and I overheard this conversation between this young woman and this man, and she was telling him that she was pregnant, and he was telling her that it was not his. And I had very small children at the time, and I could not stop thinking about how much harder her life was about to get. And I played that what if game, and out came a novel. And if you've read that novel, you'll know that there's another character in there named Cora who doesn't get her due. And I thought about Cora for 4 years. An idea was there, and it was lurking, but I think I needed to turn 40 in order to tell her story, to, pardon me, give less fucks. I needed to care less about what y'all thought so I could tell her story. And the title story of the collection, Here in the Dark, is Cora's story. And I wanted to talk about that story because sometimes ideas turn into stories real easy, and sometimes they need to sit. And sometimes you as a writer need to be different in order to do justice to that story. And I love that story, and it's full of all of the things that I love about genre fiction, and it's sexy, and it's fast-paced, and it's intense, but it also addresses so many of the themes that I'm obsessed with: motherhood and addiction and misogyny and police corruption. It also has the most scandalous line that I have ever written in the first paragraph, so I can't read it to you. You'll have to buy it, sorry. When Here in the Dark, the book, was in production, the poet laureate of Ohio, Carrie Gunter Seymour, approached me and asked me to write a story for an anthology that she produces every year, and it's called Women Speak, and it's poetry and prose written by Appalachian women. And I knew that the anthology was tied to a speaking series, so if I was going to be in it, I was going to have to read the story aloud a lot. And so I knew it needed to be first person, because first person just reads so much more vividly than third. And I knew that it maybe needed to be a little cleaner than my usual work. And actually, Carrie edited out any of the curse words that I added. But it's called Quilt Club, and it's about community and family in Appalachia. And it feels like the right story to read to you tonight, given the situation in my town. So I'm going to read it for you. When Dreama first invited me to her quilting club, I didn't think anything of it. I certainly didn't think about murder. I'm not crafty, but I know plenty of ladies are, so it's not weird. And frankly, after months in this town with no friends and only boxes to keep me company, I probably would have been happy to talk to someone wearing prison orange. I was leaving the TV on for company during the day and carrying a paperback with me to Tyler's practices as a shield to hide my growing loneliness and to ignore the empty bench around me. I was hoping that the looming election season would bring door-to-door canvassers. I didn't care which side they were on. Just being approached by a stranger was so thrilling that my palms were sweating, so I wasn't worried about anything other than if I had bad breath or if I was laughing too loud at her jokes. Dreama and I had just been talking about how I love to bake, and I thought we were sharing all of those get-to-know-you type pleasantries while standing on the sidelines of Bobby and Tyler's football game. And she just asked what church I attended. So, it felt innocent. Excited as I was, it took me a couple of weeks to actually get there. Things around here were bonkers. Moving is terrible. I'm never packing or unpacking another box again. So between trying to get settled in the house and trying to figure out where the grocery store and the post office is, it was a minute. But also, I'll admit, I was intimidated. Even though he's been away for decades now, this is Daryl, my husband's hometown and not mine, and he kept making comments about how these women were going to be my new best friends, and soon we'd have inside jokes and be planning a girls' getaway to the outlet mall, and I just kept picturing them asking me to leave. The first time I went, I brought an ooey gooey butter cake. It's my mother's recipe. Her people are from St. Louis. It's kind of a cheater dish because you use a cake mix for the base, but it always turns out perfect, and no one can tell. It's nice to bring something in a 9x13 pan too, since I didn't know how many of us there would be. Turns out I'm number 6, which is perfect. I could bring a pie. I don't have any quilting stuff. No fabric or even a needle and thread, but I figured there would be some there, and there was. Melissa had a whole basket of these beautiful little jewel-toned scraps, but we didn't even take them out. It just sat on the floor by the door. Natalie was passing around drinks, 4 roses that time, but I learned that it depended on whose job it was to bring the beverages. Dreama's husband makes his granddaddy's shine, and it's a treat. But Laura is always trying to lose weight, so she brings those horrible White Claw things, and we all secretly bring flasks in our purse. So it seemed like it was going to be refreshments and gossiping, and I was pleasantly surprised no sewing until Dreama cleared her throat and pulled out her notebook, and the other women stopped talking and turned towards her. And Dreama said, "Larry is in jail, so we'll need to drop off some supplies to Juanita again, and she don't want to take them, so just ring the doorbell and run." And then Melissa piped in, "The McNeeses are still at her mama's because their GoFundMe hasn't coughed up enough to get them their own place. And I've heard the boys have clothes and toys. It's Wanda, She's thick like us, and people keep donating this itty-bitty stuff. So maybe, Carrie, you could help with that." "Surely," Carrie said, and it was the first time I had heard her speak. And at my bewildered expression, Dreama said, "Carrie works at the Goodwill. If we know what we need, she can rescue the good stuff from the donations before they make it to the sorters." "Screw the man," Carrie said. You know how much those bastards are making on donated clothes? Assholes. And then Laura mentioned that she saw Kylie Palmer at the Food Lion with a black eye under a mountain of concealer, and the sighs came in so many directions, I don't know whose they were. But Dreama flipped some pages in the book. Natalie, she said, looking over the top of her reading glasses. Yes, ma'am, I'm on it, Natalie said, and then added, you know, I saw Marty Nix at the flea market the other weekend trying to sell her old clothes. She's already burned through all of her jewelry and all of Clive's tools trying to pay that goddamn pen loan. Carrie coughed loudly and shook her head, and then before I knew it, Dreama had closed the book and stuck it in her bag, and then everybody had moved on to what those men were building out by the highway, and if it was going to be a Starbucks like everybody hoped or just another Dunkin' Donuts. Seems obvious now what I was getting myself into. Even when I went home and Daryl asked how it was and what we did, and I said, good, and gossip. Figures, he said. See, you ain't got no reason to be scared of them. The second meeting, they roped me into helping me scour Eddie Lee's place. His twins brought lice home from school, and Ed was entirely in over his head with those two since their mama joined Jesus. It was complicated by the fact that he didn't trust the pharmacist no more and was trying to only use the natural stuff. But apple cider vinegar and mayonnaise were getting him nothing but an infestation. So we put the permethrin in unmarked bottles, and I told him it was my granny's recipe. The third and fourth meeting were more of the same, and since I've proven myself not to be squeamish about the lice, Dreama brought me along to help deal with the rats at her neighbor's place, and it felt so good to be helpful and to have this connection. And I knew I was lonely, but I didn't realize how isolated I had been. Their high-pitched laughs and their fruity perfumes and the shared recipes felt like cocaine. Sisterhood. I didn't think anything of it when Kylie Palmer's boyfriend disappeared into rehab in California, some said. Some said it was Maine. So it'd been 4 months or so, and Daryl, Tyler, and I were settling in, and Tyler was getting good grades, and he had a girlfriend, and he didn't feel like the new kid anymore, and I'm pretty sure that's Bobby's doing. He'd been so kind, inviting Tyler to all sorts of events and keeping him from hiding in his room those stupid video games, and Daryl liked being back home, even if it was forced on us thanks to the paper plant shutting down and his mama dying. And he reconnected with his brother and all of his high school friends, and I learned to like it here too. I didn't think I was gonna. I'm used to the land being a little flatter, the sky a little bigger. I'm still not convinced that one of these tight hollers, it ain't just gonna fold in on itself and eat me. But folks around here have been real friendly since I started going to Quilt Club, and Kevin has been introducing us to folks who can help renovate the house and taking Daryl to all sorts of events. Kevin is Daryl's little brother, and when we lived in Canton, we used to say good for nothing in front of that, but since moving home, Daryl's dropped it, and when I said it, he said, no matter what, he's our people. You gotta stick with your people. I'm not sure Kevin's changed much, but when he started his own business, he's his own boss, and Daryl's jealous of that. When Daryl's job disappeared and Mama Hen got sick, it was an easy choice to move home, but when Mama died, now all we have is Kevin. I guess I'm of two minds about it. Leopards don't change their spots, but Daryl says I'm too sensitive. He says I'm taking my frustration about the house out on him. Like the fact that the roof leaks and there's water in the crawl has something to do with Kevin. It does though, don't it? Wouldn't he have known that Mama's house was rotten from the inside? Couldn't he have warned us? Maybe he wanted us trapped in that soggy house. It bothers me, too, that Daryl spends all of his free time with Kevin and keeps inviting him over for dinner, and Kevin licks his plate every time and still feels the need to suggest what I could do to make my meals more appetizing. He always has seconds of dessert, too, but isn't satisfied unless it's a pie. But he also brings a bottle of something expensive to drink. And he claps Daryl on the back, and he says, brother, and he teases Tyler about girls, and he brags that his nephew is the best on the team, and both of my men just beam. It was a few months before I told the ladies about him. And I thought I caught a look between Natalie and Carrie, but maybe not. It was in Laura's living room, and Dreama put her elbows on her knees, and she said, tell me more. And I'm embarrassed now that I said some petty and spiteful things. It's not his fault that everything leaks, and we would have chosen to stay in Mama's house anyway since it was free, so it's not like anything would have changed if he'd warned us. And it's good that Daryl has a friend. I guess I have sour grapes. What do you know about his business? Carrie asked. And I was embarrassed again because I barely knew anything. I have a tendency to tune out when Kevin talks, or whenever Daryl was talking about Kevin, he just irritates me so. I couldn't even stand to listen to Daryl talking about him, or the money that Kevin was making, or how he was going to pull him into the business and make him an equal partner. So I said, solar power is apparently the wave of the future. And with everybody needing energy and fuel disappearing, and Kevin helps folks find programs that help them pay for their panels because it's such a special technology. And so they invest a little bit now, and soon they'll be selling energy to the government and making money hand over fist, and they can borrow the money and pay it back later. And there must be some truth in it because Kevin's really doing good for himself, I said. And then I did see the look and the nod that Laura added in Dreama's direction, and I figured that they all thought that I was an idiot to be complaining about this man who was going to help my husband get started in a good business. And Melissa nodded and passed around the molasses cookies that I'd made again. And Dreama said, you know what we do here, right? Unquilt, I said. And they all laughed. Well, that's what we tell everybody, Melissa said. But, Dreama said, we help, I said, and I felt all of their eyes on me. When the creek rises and floods a house, we find shelter and supplies for the family, and when somebody doesn't have enough to eat, we feed them, and when they are cold, we find firewood, and when somebody needs to dry out, we get them to rehab. Sometimes, Natalie interrupted, if it's a mama with babies, yes. If it's a good-for-nothing wife beater, well, that's different. We all know about Kevin, Carrie said. We need your help. I was still thinking about what Natalie said about the wife beater, how this town had less crime and fewer addicts and a more vibrant community than most, and I wondered at what cost. Why? I asked. Because if we waited for the men, Dreama said, we'd be waiting forever. No, I said, why me? I don't know anything about this kind of stuff. I made myself pass out pulling out a sliver from my foot one time. You're tougher than you think, Dreama said. You carried a person inside your body and you pushed him out and you raised him and you survived him turning 3 and then 13. And you've been married to the same man for 20 years and we knew your mother-in-law. If you haven't killed anyone yet, don't sell yourself short. And if you have, well, what do you want me to do? I said. Just keep your mind open, Dreama said. You know those freaking panels aren't free. He's saddling most of the vulnerable of us with mountains of debt that we can't pay back, Carrie said. He gets them a loan against future production, and then there isn't enough or any, and so they end up having to pay. And of course, by then they don't take the panels back, sucking every penny out of folks who ain't got any, and it's not right. It's always something, Dreama said. They're always pulling something out of us, out of our dirt, out of our labor, and now they're fooling us into thinking that our sunshine, what little there is of it, has value, and we can make gold out of light. Laura starts laughing. There ain't barely any sunlight that reaches into the nooks and crannies of these hollers. That's why the special panels, I said. Lord mercy, they got you fooled too, Natalie said. Next, they'll be telling us to farm kudzu, because you know it's awful easy to grow. And then, of course, it made sense. What they're doing, what they wanted me to do, what good I could do. And I went home more confused than I had been in a long time. I didn't have friends like this in Canton. I didn't think I ever would. And I've never felt this coming together, this knitting of lives, this shared history and future. And then the answer was easy. An epiphany that wasn't a light bulb illuminated over my head, but a hand picking up a shovel. This was friendship and family and community too, to stand with your people, to do what needed to be done. So I baked a pie. With enough of Dreama's leftover rat poison to kill a horse. And I brought it to the next quilt club meeting. I have the answer, ladies, I said, putting the pie on Natalie's coffee table. So before we move on to questions, I just want to point out that writers and stories are on journeys. And that this is what worked for me. But it might not work for you. But if you do the work, it will come. And you're going to have to be willing to pick yourself up off the ground over and over, because you will get knocked down. You will hear no more than any other word. Truly, the whole thing is about tenacity. There are no overnight successes in publishing, and if it looks like there are, it's because you're not seeing the work in the background. But it's worth it. It's worth it when one reader connects with you and says that they feel less alone because of what you wrote. It's worth it when one reader tells you that they learned something. So the work is hard, but keep going, because we need your story. Thank you. I don't know what time it is. Do we have time for questions? Oh, thank you. So we got some minutes. Who's got one? Yeah.
So you say you like new fiction, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Would it be considered like historical fiction or like personal fiction?
Some of it is historical, right? And I'm sure you guys are all young, so your version of history is different than my version of history, because the 90s was a long time for you, right? You weren't even alive, but I was, a teenager. So some of my work is historical fiction and some isn't. I don't know if I would call it autofiction, which is the blending of memoir, or when you kind of fictionalize something that's part of your life. But definitely it's drawn from the well of traumas that I've lived through, or stories that I've heard.
So trauma's really motivated you.
It has. But it doesn't, if you don't have trauma in your life, awesome, you can still be a writer. But I think that some of the depth of of the stories that we all love the most come from heartbreak, from bad things happening and surviving.
I'll take that into consideration.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks for your question.
What are you working on now?
Oh, that's such a hard question. I wrote a crime novel and gave it to my agent, and she sent it back with revisions. So that's what I'm working on right now. But I also have another manuscript under consideration and a short story collection out in the world being shopped. So I'm writing some novels, but I have some fingers in pies, because that's what you need to do, right? You need to have work out all the time, and it takes a long time to get anything published. So just spread it around like birdseed.
Whenever you started, or whenever you sort of began writing short stories, like whenever you start writing short stories, do you have in mind that you're going to put them into a collection eventually, or is it just you tell these stories as they come to you?
That's a great question, Lucas. Right now, I'm writing a short story because my collection needs one more. And that's a really weird position to be in, because you're like trying to fit something. It's like an album for anybody who makes music, right? You already have a vision and you're trying to shove something in. But prior to that, it was really more just lightning striking. And then discovering that I had all of these stories. And then when you go to create a collection, you pick and choose. So for Here in the Dark, I had 40 plus published stories, and I just picked the crime ones out. The new collection is called Burnt Church, that I'm working on, and it needs one more story because I'm a crazy person. And so I'm trying to write something that feels like it belongs, but that's harder than I really should have just let it go, but I can't.
So when I was reading, I would read more than one story at a time, and there sometimes seemed to be a trail. Do you decide the order of the stories?
I did decide the order of the stories, and it's cool that you saw a trail, because those stories, the first one that I ever published is in there, so from like 2014, but there's one that I just wrote 2 years ago, so it's been a long time. It's like 8 years of stories, so it's fun that there's connections that you saw. Cool. Yeah.
When you're developing a story, do you feel that you come up with a story first and then your symbolism comes later? Or do you ever sit down and think, I really want to write about bodily autonomy, I want to write about, or do you think the story usually comes first and then you realize what you want to say?
I think the story comes first, because I think everything has to, you have to sacrifice everything to the story, right? Because unless it's a good story, nobody reads it. Because if I sit down and I'm like, I need to write a story about misogyny, there's too many places to go, right? So you think of a story idea, and actually I would say even those big themes don't even come out in the first draft. That's revision, right? Once I know what the story is and how it ends, then I can see, oh, this is actually about being fat. You know, this is actually about being pissed off at my mother-in-law. And I didn't know until I got to the end. But then you can go in, and that's, revision is my favorite stage. Drafting is, it's painful. It's like giving birth or throwing up or some other disgusting metaphor about bodily functions. But revision is making a diamond out of coal, right? You just polish and cut and rearrange and cut some more and rearrange and cut some more. And usually I'll go from like, you know, a 5,000 or 10,000 word story to a 3,500 word story, because there's all that extra that you guys don't need to read, but I needed to know in order to tell the story the way I needed it to come out. And that's when you find the, oh. And that's why I have fights with professors about literary criticism all the time, because I don't think any writer sits down and is like, you know what this is really gonna be about? This theme. I think that that emerges from the story, and it just happens. Awesome.
So my favorite short story was the one with the encrypted. And you said you usually don't do that kind of thing. I was just curious, like, do you think you'll ever write another one in the future, or was that like a one-off kind of?
About cryptids?
Yeah.
I think I'm getting braver, and so my work is getting weirder. So I'm not saying no, because I have noticed, like, maybe not cryptids, but I have some things with ghosts, you know, when I first started writing, I thought that I had to be writing lit fic in order to be taken seriously, and I've found that that's not only not true, but that readers are just as excited about genre fiction, if not more. That more people read romance than any other genre. And that's not what I write, unfortunately. It'd be nice, because then I can pay my bills. But you gotta just write what your heart is telling you, right? And if it's gold nuggets and roadkill, like, don't be afraid to be weird. And that's often, I think, like, if you're feeling blocked, be weirder. Do something stranger, because that unlocks something. But yeah, cryptids, I don't know. I know a lot about Meshy Peshu, and I don't know a lot about like Bigfoot or Mothman and stuff, so I'm also like lazy that way. I don't love to do a lot of research. So yeah, I'm glad that you like that story. It's weird to me, like, how, you know, because you write stories and I have my favorites and ones that mean a lot to me, and then like that one ends up in Best American Mystery. And I'm like, really? The cryptid one? You know, and Karma, you guys have read the book, that's a tough story. I would not have thought that that would be the one that made it this year. Because you know, killing a child is usually death for a story. But not, apparently, that one. Well, y'all, it has been, oh yeah.
So I'm in Dr. Karshner's creative writing class, and we're going to be starting on our first creative fiction piece. I wanted to just kind of know more about your method of like the suppose and what if, and how to like work with that and like writing our stories.
Sure, I take my suppose and write a whole bunch of what ifs, and I think that you guys did that today, right? And then I take those what ifs and I try to think of as many possible what ifs as I can. Like 15 is not too many for a short story. As many as you can, and then give it a day and go back, and which ones are like the weirdest and the most interesting. Because you remember these stories, like Dr. Karshner said, because of some weird, grotesque, absurd part, right? Like, it's the story about the cryptids, it's the story about the gold nuggets, it's the story about the pug eyeballs, right? That's what you remember. If I said, oh, the story's about the mother and daughter, you're like, which story about the mother and daughter? So look at your what ifs and which ones are the weirdest or the most striking scenes. Which ones, if they were movies, would be the most exciting? And then put those in order. And I like to do a 6-sentence outline, which I can send to Dr. Karcher and he can share with y'all, where, you know, your first sentence, I stole this from another writer who teaches at George Mason. Your first sentence is, you know, the description of your character, and your second sentence is what, and my poor fiction students are like, yes, we know. The second sentence is the desire, and the third sentence is the inciting incident. What did this character choose to do? And you will notice that your what ifs will fall into those, right? And then what conflicts is this character who has this desire for something, these legs to get out of the ocean, what conflicts is that character going to face? And then what's the turning point? How does the character change? And hopefully you have a what if around that. And if you don't, then that's where to focus, right? Because you need to know how your character is going to change or what they're going to face that's going to force them to make a turning point. And then I never, ever have a resolution, ever, until I write it. And I'm a jerk that way because I make my students have a resolution, sorry y'all, when they hand in their 6-sentence outline to me. But I never have an outline because I just never know where it's going until the end. But think of some sort of way to finish it and then allow yourself to stray off the path, right? Because I'm fully like outline all the time, be prepared, have a plan. I'm a working mom, I have 0 time. When I get to write, I gotta write. I can't just like wander around in the dark. But I also know that the characters talk to you, right? And they tell you where you're supposed to be going. And so if I just follow this character and trust them, they will find the right ending. So does that help? And please feel free, any of you, to email me with any story questions at any time. I'm happy to get back to you. Although I will say I don't have any internet or power at my house right now, so it might be just a little bit. But I will get back to you. Cool, y'all. Well, with that, I'm going to leave you with that. lucasme@rmu.edu. Please feel free to reach out to me. I will get back to you. It has been an honor to talk to you. It has been an honor that you read my book. It really means the world to me. Thank you.